Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and good evening. Welcome to the first event of the Cambridge University Center for Geopolitics Indo-Pacific Roundtable 2025. Tonight being held in conjunction here with the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, here in Whitehall, central London. It's the first time we've done an event together, and we hope it won't be the last. We hope to continue this collaboration in many other forms. And so today we're going to be talking with a group of expert panelists on UK and Europe relations with the Indo-Pacific, security, economic, and other dimensions. And so it'll be quite a wide-ranging discussion over many sets of issues. And let me also just remind everyone we are being recorded, which means that if you wish to speak or ask a question, please wait for the microphone for purposes of the recording, even though you can be heard in the room without a microphone reasonably well. So before introducing the panelists, let me just set the stage a bit of the topic. Since the end of World War II, in the Indo-Pacific broadly construed, the dominant security and economic player for many, many years was the United States. Now, that wasn't always a smooth dominance or guarantee of both security and economic growth. If we can look across different parts of the Cold War and see incidents like the Korean War, the decade of security disorder between 1965 and 75, to put it sort of euphemistically, and later on, a lot of friction around trade and supposed trade deficits and trade practice issues between the United States and many of its most important partners in fact, the Indo-Pacific. Today, really over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen at least phased retreat from that leadership in some areas by the United States. We can look at that in terms of the pivot to Asia by the Obama administration that really didn't materialize and was in fact a withdrawal from much of Asia, I would argue. Certainly, the Trump administration today seems to be pulling back from any position of leadership there. And sort of leaving the stage to others in many ways, both in terms of the tariffs and the trade restrictions, but also in terms of perhaps security posture. At the same time, many states in Asia have been looking to new partners and new relationships, or old ones, but newly reinvigorated or reconfigured, in Europe, with the UK, and in the rest of the world. Right? And so that leaves open this very big question now of what is the proper role for the UK in particular and for Europe in general in the Indo-Pacific in this new reality, right? Is there in fact a security interest? What does that look like? How should that best be advanced? What kind of economic opportunities and interests really exist? What kind of threats are there economically, if any? And how best to coordinate with partners in Europe, Asia, and North America in order to advance those agendas. So we have with us today 4 experts on different dimensions of this. We have first Philip Shetler-Jones from here at RUSI, where he's the Director of Indo-Pacific Security, I believe. Is that the official title? Senior Research Fellow. Yeah, or the person in charge of Indo-Pacific security issues here at RUSI. Then Andrew Caney, also affiliated to RUSI, who's a Senior Associate Fellow and works on sort of trade, economics, and lots of dimensions of China, Greater China, Asia in general. Bill Hayton from Chatham House, who is focused largely on Southeast Asia, but thinks about Asia in general in many ways. And then finally, Leslie Vinjamuri, also from Chatham House and professor at SOAS, who works on the United States, US foreign policy and interactions with other parts of the world, including in Asia and the Pacific. So let's start off first with Philip Shetler-Jones and your take on security and any other dimensions of these issues that you'd like to speak to.
Thanks, Bill. Very nice to be here. Nice to be at the start of what was a great event I attended last year, and looking forward to the other speakers and the questions afterwards. Thinking of the history of this, you talked about the US from sort of World War II having the dominance. And if I think about the UK or Europe, there was certainly the withdrawal from the region in different ways of sort of decolonization, involvement in some of the wars, the Korean War, of course, the emergencies and confrontations in Southeast Asia. And then I suppose for the UK, Hong Kong in '97 was sort of the last point where we moved largely what had remained there out. And so I suppose if you think of what's happened for the last 15 years, what we sometimes talk about as the Indo-Pacific tilt, it's a sort of pendulum swinging back. My impression is that it's led very much by the sense of the economic importance of the region, the opportunities for partaking growth and investment opportunities, and leading off from that, the observation that the stability and security of the region is therefore much more in our interest. And so it's a sort of back to basics if you think about the forces which drew Europeans, I think, into that part of the world hundreds of years ago. But I think you have to put it in proportion if you think about our security role in the region and conclude that it's rather minor. And that's partly because the increasing power, military power and security activity of the other countries in the region. I'm not sure that the US has retreated in a phased way, as you put it. I think there's something happening with the US posture in the region, which can look like retreat. So bringing troops, for example, out of Okinawa, moving them to Guam, or moving them to Northern Australia. But I think that's more to do with positioning with respect to more capable missile systems and weapons from China, rather than coming sort of out of the region. But we can probably come back to that. But the question about the US dominance, I think, is connected a bit to our role. So I always found it interesting, around this time of year, you have the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, and the US Defense Secretary would go and always be asked by someone the same question, which is, how do you feel about Europeans being here as well, or some formulation of that? And he tended to look a bit uncomfortable and shy and look at his shoes and say, you know, how great it is having allies in the region. But you got the feeling his heart wasn't really in it. And I think you sometimes get mixed signals from across the Atlantic about how our role or ambitions in the region are seen. And I suppose that's been given a bit more salience since the intensification of the Ukraine war, where the sentiment seems to be often, look, you have more than enough to do in your own region, and you know you might be more trouble than you're worth in our region, so better you stay home. And I think a version of that was articulated by Elbridge Colby, senior defense official dealing with Asia policy in the present administration. So I think there is a bit of ambiguity there about where we fit into an American posture in the region. So I think one of the questions, though, we have to look at is, are we competitive? You know, whatever our scale there. And I think that's partly a technology question now, because the Chinese military technology is setting the bar, really. And I think you can see that in the case of the recent fighting between Pakistan and India, where you know, people flying either Indian or Russian or French equipment are going up against Chinese equipment, and it's performing pretty well. We don't know much of the detail of what happened yet, but I think that's something we'll see more and more of, which is if you're a middle power, it's going to be very important to get access to this kind of top level, whether it's 6th generation aircraft or submarines. You're going to want it, because if you don't have it, you know, you're at a severe disadvantage. So I think that's, in the case of the UK, what makes the Global Combat Air Program with Japan very important, and similar with AUKUS, is there are different pathways to getting to the same thing, which is you're a middle power without a superpower budget, but you want access to the absolutely top-notch level of technology in the military sphere. In some areas, like hypersonic weapons, you know, we are at risk in Europe, I think, of being left behind. There's countries like Japan, South Korea, not necessarily in partnership, but sometimes with their own abilities are attaining, you know, quite a lot of progress through their research and development. And I think that that's why these partnerships like GCAP and AUKUS are probably a bit the way of the future. Talk a little bit about Taiwan, and then I'll pass on to Andrew. But I think one of the questions I've frequently asked in the region is, what makes you think you can make any difference here? You've only got a small permanent presence. Every now and then your aircraft carriers come out, but we don't always know, how often that's going to happen in the future. And anyway, they're not equivalent to a US carrier and so on. So I have these discussions about whether we're really making any difference to deterrence. And I think one way we do make a difference is that it's on the cognitive level, which is the narrative from Beijing is that Taiwan is an internal issue, none of your business anyway, or it's a regional issue, also none of your business because you're not a regional country. And so don't get the idea or propagate the idea that what happens around Taiwan is an issue of global interest. And I think our presence there with a capability like that is a refutation of that narrative. And I think that's a healthy thing, because the effects of such a crisis would absolutely be all of our business. And so we have a stake in helping to deter it. I think there are other areas, domains of warfare like cyber and space, which are also not really containable to a certain region. If you're a Japanese company worried about being hacked or hostage-ware, then what happens to Marks and Spencers in London is just as relevant to you and your systems as if it had happened to a supermarket in Japan. So I'm glad to see that we're active and cooperating in those areas as well. So I think in a way it's an irony that we have a very conventional bit of equipment like an aircraft carrier going there, when actually it's some of these more unconventional domains where our involvement in Indo-Pacific security might be more meaningful. And I'm talking about that at technology level. So the last point is the debate is often in Europe whether we should concentrate on our region or allocate a certain amount of attention and resources to Asia. But I think I would say it should be a different question, which is, do we want to just stay in our region, but then lose that sort of reference to the pacing or the threat which is setting the bar for military competitiveness? And if we do avoid the region and we don't match ourselves against what's really the sort of top tier performer in the military sphere, then we do risk obsolescence in a security sense globally, because sooner or later that Chinese technology is going to get all kinds of places where we have other security interests. So yeah, are we risking a loss of competitiveness if we succumb to the argument that we need to keep to our knitting in Europe?
One quick follow-up on some of that is, to what extent would partnerships with countries in Europe be key to any of this? Obviously, partnerships with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, other regional actors are important. And in fact, I believe that the GCAP program also has an Italian partner in addition to the British and Japanese. But are there other European powers that have the capability to really be present in the Indo-Pacific to the same or greater extent than the UK? And how can the UK actually leverage cooperation with them, perhaps in a more vigorous way than has been done so far? Or is it not really feasible? Are the European powers simply too small or not interested enough in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think Italy's involvement in GCAP is a really good example, because if you'd asked people 10 years ago, who would be a partner in a project like that, Italy might not have been the first country that came to mind. But there are other countries, Scandinavian countries, Central Eastern European countries, with really useful niche technology to contribute. So that's one area where it can happen. Yes, the obvious other European with a similar capability is France, but it seems like we are not able to get out of a sort of competitive partnership with France, whereby I remember years ago we talked about alternating deployments of aircraft carriers, or we have these agreements. Is it Lancaster House we have with France? So, but I don't think we've ever managed to turn that into something that looks coherent and organized in a sort of team spirit. It seems more like we compare one to the other. And then you've got real competition about, I mean, as AUKUS showed,
Yeah.
in the defense industry, you've got national champions or, industries that are actually in head-to-head competition. And that's something else probably worth mentioning, which is our presence and our role there also has a commercial interest. We're partly interested in accessing the defense markets of that region, not just the markets for all these other things.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for very insightful comments. That's actually also a very good segue into what I think Andrew Caney is about to talk about in terms of trade, the economy, capital flows, and other dimensions, both of sort of China's economic situation, but also the region as a whole.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks everyone. Great to be here and involved again. I think we've been involved every year of these Indo-Pacific dialogues right from the very beginning, and they're always great discussions. I was going to pick up initially on Philip's point around competitiveness and talking there about engaging in various, we say, more or less allied or like-minded country technologies. But it brought to mind the phrase of a chap called Jörg Wuttke, who's like the master of foreign business in China. He lived in China 34 years, headed up BASF in China, and led the European Chamber of Commerce for 20 years in China. And he describes China as a fitness routine. You need to be there in the room, doing gym, doing your exercises, because everything there is so competitive. And if there's a multinational company you're not present in China, you're going to get flabby and loose and end up losing to Chinese competitors. And I think this puts a sharp focus on this word Indo-Pacific, because it is by definition, and I was checking this again before I came here tonight, it includes China. Because it's in the Indo-Pacific. But China hates the phrase Indo-Pacific, sees it having the history of the Japanese and the Indians coming together to contain or manage China. And the work I've been doing here with Chatham House colleagues a year or so ago on a transatlantic approach to the Indo-Pacific was really always around, well, how do we deal with China? And that's certainly there from a security perspective. That's a real question. But as soon as one gets into the economics, then you think about China as the major economy in the region, as a major market in itself, as a dominant exporter, both of leading edge innovation and of excess capacity. And then we can debate when that is sort of a good thing and when is that a bad thing and actually harming different countries. And so we need, as the UK, to look at that and say, well, what's our opportunity in China? What's our opportunity in the rest of Asia or the rest of the Indo-Pacific? And how can we also help that system manage itself? Asia has grown dramatically off the basis of trade, gradual liberalization, inclusion. And talking about the US stepping back, the US stepped back clearly from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A few years ago, the Asians went ahead and created the CPTPP. They've also created RCEP. And so Asia has taken this initiative on next generation trade agreements, others in the digital area, deeper as well, Singapore, New Zealand, elsewhere. And of course, the UK has joined CPTPP. Analytically, that has a very small impact on the UK's trade. I think it's 0.06% or something of GDP. Firstly, the number's probably too low because the way dynamics things change. But it really underweights the importance that the UK can bring into that environment to have new generation trade agreements, new ways of working together at a time when the US has pulled back completely from having proper discussions on trade liberalization, on innovation. Again, I was looking up again, there was a thing called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was around a few years ago. Very, very little has happened on that. There were a few things happening on supply chain security, particularly on the defense side, but basically the US is not present. As a reflection of that, about 3 weeks ago, I was in Jakarta talking to the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. And before I went, I sort of wanted to know what's the topic I meant to be talking on. And it kept changing. And initially, and I think this reflects also the world we're in, it started off as China Plus. Let's come and talk about China Plus. And I was sort of, what does China Plus mean? And nobody really knew. And then I started to think what it might mean. And in a business context, it means these days China +1, China +2. I am doing all my manufacturing in China. I'm going to go somewhere else as well to support it. But I don't think that's what really what it means for Indonesia. What it means for Indonesia is China is our major trading partner, and we're going to keep investing in that relationship. Very, very close relationships. And we're also going to work with them to get inbound investment. And you, coming from the airport, I had the choice of a Hyundai electric vehicle or a BYD electric vehicle. And there were no European brands, there were no American brands. That's going to keep going. And then the plus is, what else can we do with it, which other countries? And that can be the UK, it can be the rest of Europe. We talked in the meeting about Africa and many, many other countries. And then by the time I got to the presentation, the title of the presentation had changed, and the China Plus had disappeared. Instead, it was called, you're laughing, Kat. It was then called Trade Agreements Post-Liberation Day. And so the whole focus of the discussion had what had Trump announced and what do we do about it? Now, it didn't actually change the discussion in the room at all, because it was a given that, well, basically, we can't rely on the US. We've got some trade there. Maybe it will come back. We don't know. It's just too uncertain. Let's not spend time talking about that. What can we do? And the focus was, one, we Indonesia have a lot of trade agreements already, and we're not using them enough. We're not using them as well as Vietnam does. And secondly, we should write some more trade agreements. And we're up for it, and let's go talk to anybody. So there is this tremendous appetite in the region, which I think the UK can feed into. There is a desire in the region for some help in coalesce that. I remember discussions with Vietnam years ago. And on the flip side of what's the UK missing out is there are a whole lot of new sort of rules and mechanisms that need to be written, particularly around digital trade, services, AI governance, and so on. And again, the US is not taking a position on most of those things. There are clear positions coming out of China on almost every single one of those. There are sophisticated discussions in places like Singapore, to extent Korea, Japan, and very much in the UK. So the UK can get involved, can bring something, can benefit from the discussion we were having 5 years or so ago that, yes, Asia is so much of the future, it's where the innovation is, it's where the new technology standards are going to be taken. I think the final point I'll touch on is this idea of providing options and choices. The UK as another option. The debate goes on around, will countries, will companies, will people have to choose between the US and China? And nobody wants to choose. Why would you want to choose? Why would you want to go one way or the other and become dependent on the other? There is an open question as to how far the Trump administration will push a need to choose. I mean, in the draft UK-US trade deal, there's again talk about referring on particular strategic industries and investments, getting that agreed with the US. How serious and how intensely would the US push? How persistently would the US push? And we see that in areas like Malaysia, which has got huge investments in data centers. I think 60% of the exports go in semiconductors to the US, where 60% of the exports to the US are semiconductors. It was going to get, it was going to be in the middle category under the thing called the AI diffusion rule. It couldn't get the absolute best chips under the Biden proposals. That would harm its position as a data center country. That's not now going to happen. Is other controls going to be tighter or looser? Will they then end up choosing Chinese chips versus American chips? Do they get better? I say nobody wants to choose, but then the US puts 3,000% imports tariffs on solar panels from Cambodia, and at that level, you're certainly going to choose in some way. So into this environment where nobody wants to choose, and probably they won't need to, and there's a lot of signaling backwards and forwards, the UK and Europe more broadly can offer some sort of alternative. Maybe it's a middle way, maybe it's just another choice. I was in a discussion on Latin America recently, and Brazil was so pleased. We are following our multi-alignment strategy, and we really like it. And then some, I call them Westerners, people like me, British people, Americans, whatever, French, sometimes sort of poo-poo this multi-alignment of, oh, it all sounds very nice. What does it really mean? Well, it's actually about a country having some options and being able to create its own sort of portfolio of deals. And I think the UK has a lot it can play within that in Asia.
Great, thank you very much. I just also have one follow-up in this case, which is that if we think about China's economic position in both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, it is increasingly the dominant economic player, certainly in terms of international trade. So, I mean, that's true for South Korea as much as it's true for Indonesia or Malaysia, even to a greater extent. And so the question would be, from the position of the UK, how should one approach that? Is this something that could benefit British trade relations or, economic policy in some way, as indeed was sold by many people who supported Brexit some years ago, that there's a possibility of maybe a comprehensive trade deal with China or increased trade with China as an economic opportunity for Britain? Or conversely, if we were to decide for security or other reasons that this is not in British interest to have a stronger relationship economically with China, but rather to sort of counter China's economic position through frameworks, perhaps like CPTPP or others, how best to pursue that with partners in the region or beyond?
Okay. I think it's sort of both, or it's more the second than the first. So there's very much a role for the UK to play, given its sheer size, its history, its actual capabilities, and putting some of these agreements together to help put a counterweight into whatever these emerging Asian agreements are, or are these agreements going to link up with European ones and so on in future. And I think that it is a voice for making these more liberal, in a sense, making more of a pushback on various aspects that China might want to advance. And that's something that is wished for by a number of the CPTP members and elsewhere. And it may help nudge China in the right direction. I'm skeptical that there's a huge potential for the UK of increased, say, exports into China. I think continued investment, having a few sizable British companies create their own business in China, as we already have. We have the AstraZenecas, the Unilevers, and so on. I was hearing that Brompton Bicycles are 50% of their sales in China. So a bunch of things you can do there. This idea of exporting into China for the higher income economies, the more value-added areas, looks very difficult. And in fact, the challenge, I didn't get a chance to go into much, is around this mix of, yes, the Chinese EVs are great. At the same time, Indonesia wants to develop its own industries. Everybody's got this question of trade deficits coming in with China because there's too much coming out. How do they develop their own industry?
Great. Thanks very much. And now to Bill Hayton.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. I think I echo quite a lot of what's already been said, but I'll try and put a bit of extra spin. And I think that we start off by thinking that the next month is going to set the course for large parts of UK policy towards the Indo-Pacific, probably for the next 4 years or so. And I'm aware that there are people in this room who have been involved in drafting and may even know what's in some of these documents. So the much delayed China audit is about to appear, the 4 times delayed China audit. I think the Strategic Defence Review comes out on Monday. We've got a public spending review 2 weeks today, Thursday, the 11th of June. We've got the National Security Strategy due to appear before the NATO summit, and then we've got the NATO summit in The Hague on the 24th and 25th of June. So probably, come back here in a month and we'll have a much better idea of where UK policy is going. But I'll have a guess, and I'm now going to say something unwise, but hopefully memorable. I think the TLDR of UK strategic relations with the Indo-Pacific is that we have too many unhealthy people in Britain to be able to fulfill our security commitments in Asia. Or to put that in a more think tank phraseology, we're faced with a war in Europe, major strategic uncertainties with Washington, and a massive and rising demand for welfare spending at home. And as a result, defense priorities are going to have to shift away from Asia. And what I have heard, and I wait for the bits of paper to be published, is that our 2 offshore patrol vessels in Asia are coming home. So it's going to be quite a lot of strong messaging, I think, required to tell Asia that we are still committed and focused on Asia, given that announcement is going to grab a lot of headlines. I mean, of course, our 2 OPVs do not tip the strategic balance in Asia, in any meaningful direction, but they are obviously a tangible sign of our commitment. So there's going to be an awful lot, I think, of messaging that's going to need to be done over the next few days and weeks. That said, of course, and as Philip was saying, the future of our domestic defense industry depends on our relations with the Indo-Pacific. Our Air Force, the future of our Air Force depends on GCAP. The future of our submarine force depends on AUKUS. That's where the investment is going to come from. That's how we're going to pay for them. So I think we are definitely going to stay engaged on a business and a strategic level. The question is about the operational level and what our contributions are going to be on a security in the security arena. What about the wider picture? Well, last November, Catherine West, Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, said that UK had 3 reasons for being engaged with the Indo-Pacific: boosting economic growth, and obviously that's the #1 mission of the current government, tackling climate change, although I don't know whether that's still in fashion since Trump took office, and bolstering national and international security. And I think that's a pretty good fit for what Southeast Asian governments want from us. I mean, what do elites in Southeast Asia want? Well, they also want prosperity. They also want strategic autonomy. They want options for their diplomacy and security relations. And they want respect and popular legitimacy. And I think we can work on all of those 3 things. We can be providers of trade and prosperity. We can provide options. We can help Southeast Asian states maintain their strategic autonomy. And we can treat them nicely. And we can kind of, do what Xi Jinping does and make sure that he visits, whenever the head of a country, no matter how big or small, comes to Beijing, he meets them and gives them their appropriate degree of respect. I was lunching with a Southeast Asian diplomat recently who said that for them, the lessons of Ukraine are that if you get too close to the USA, then Russia invades you. If you get too close to Russia, then you get sanctioned by the Americans. And obviously, if you're a Southeast Asian country, then you're thinking not necessarily, your analog of Russia here, of course, is China. So, of course, their response to that is going to be strategic and deep hedging and making sure that none of their eggs, or their eggs are scattered in a number of different baskets. This, of course, used to be the role of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but it ain't doing it anymore. Is ASEAN still helpful to Southeast Asian states in terms of their hedging strategies between the great powers? To some extent, but ASEAN is now so dysfunctional, obviously, problems of Myanmar to begin with, but also being pulled in different strategic directions by patrons. So, can ASEAN play this role? Or increasingly, we're seeing states opt for bilateral measures and look at the way, for example, Vietnam is building up ever more strategic partnerships with other states, with Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, on a bilateral basis in a way that it might have expected ASEAN to provide that kind of framework in the past. But ASEAN obviously still has an economic value. It's the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement Part 3 is almost done. I think it's all the hard work has been done on that, and that is going. That's an ASEAN-centered framework. Although interestingly, intra-ASEAN trade within the 10 member states of ASEAN is just 23% of ASEAN's total trade. Compare that with the EU. Intra-EU trade is 60% of total EU trade. So ASEAN is much less integrated economically within its 10 members. ASEAN's, each country is basically buying from China and selling to the US. And of course, that's a big problem with Mr. Trump at the moment. But the logic of RCEP, which Andrew was mentioning, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, but not India. So is that you will get, there's going to be RCEP world and there's going to be non-RCEP world in terms of supply chains. So it's just going to be so much easier. The bureaucracy, the tariffs, the restrictions, the regulations, et cetera, will be so much easier if you're operating within RCEP world that you can just see supply chains will have their own logic and drag people, create a sort of big center of gravity there. what does all this imply, I think, about the future of Southeast Asia? Well, I think obviously Beijing is trying to convince the world that China's supremacy is inevitable. I think there's a whole load of questions about that. I mean, Belt and Road lending, peaked quite a long time ago, 2017, I think. China is now a creditor and not a lender to most countries in what people call the global south. Good Guardian story yesterday on this theme about how much interest China will now be forced to, or will be clawing back from a lot of these countries. And particularly a country, I mean, Laos, of course, is the most desperate story in Southeast Asia. And it's clear that, Southeast Asian elites do not want Chinese dominance of their region. They want autonomy, they want options. So there's clearly a role for the UK and for Europe in the region. Leslie's going to talk about the US, but I mean, US alliance, the US hub and spoke system in Asia used to be, for a long time was the guarantor of stability. But, look at those four allies. I mean, the US alliance with Thailand is not in a good place at the moment. South Korea is a bit wobbly. The Yoon government, Mr. Yoon, ex-President Yoon, made a big play of this sort of almost like a one-man foreign policy and getting close to the US. He's obviously been chucked out of power. There's worries about the future of the alliance. There's increasing support for South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons, for example. The Philippines, I mean, it's being very, tested at the moment. And obviously, the Chinese are putting a lot of strategic effort, I think, into trying to fracture the Philippines-US alliance and trying to basically sort of break the Philippines' role in US-Taiwan contingency planning. So really, the sort of the strongest relationship of the four in Asia is the US-Japan one. But economically, of course, the US is still the market. China is not showing any signs of being an equivalent, and of course, the outcome of that is the trade deficits. But Trump's approach, I think, will generate results simply because Southeast Asian states are so locked into American markets that they're going to have to do things. The Vietnamese trade minister has just been in the US, and he was talking to Westinghouse about presumably building a nuclear power station in Vietnam. He was talking to SpaceX, presumably to get some Musk interest. He was talking to Google. He was talking to LNG exporters. And he was talking to Lockheed Martin, pretending that Vietnam is going to buy F-16s, which they never will. But there's, I think, from, look at the list of, which countries had the highest tariffs from Trump. A lot of them were Southeast Asians. Vietnam was right at the top. And I suspect there is a geopolitical agenda to Trump's tariffs. He's looking for geopolitical concessions as part of any kind of winding up trade deal. Yeah, I think there's plenty of space there because Southeast Asian countries, as we were saying, don't want to choose. They want options. We can be an option.
Great. One follow-up for you now, which is that if we think about ASEAN as a bloc, right, it is by some margin now China's largest trading partner, right? And that margin is growing, right? ASEAN trade is growing much more quickly for China than China's trade with almost any other part of the world. And ASEAN is by far actually the fastest growing and most dynamic part of what we could call the Indo-Pacific overall macro region. Now, the UK has some really important historical links in Southeast Asia, right, as you mentioned to some extent, but I think particularly in Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, we see really strong links from the UK there, and very comprehensive and healthy relationships to this day in many respects. There are certain countries as well that are really strongly tied to China geopolitically, if not always economically, but that as well, which would be sort of Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. And then there's, obviously, as you pointed out, Thailand and the Philippines that are allied to the United States. What about those two really important Southeast Asian countries in the middle, right? Vietnam and Indonesia, right? And so how should the UK then approach Vietnam and Indonesia, given that they're not exactly comfortable with China, yet have really important economic and other links to China? They're not US allies by any means and not comfortable moving towards being US allies. They're not places with which the UK has very strong historical links. certainly not the way it does in other areas in the region. And so what are the best opportunities economically for the UK, but also from the sort of general foreign policy perspective? How should the UK approach those particular two countries, given how important the region is to China in terms of South China Sea, as well as economic links growing, but also all of the various sensitivities inside those countries and from the UK perspective? How should that best be approached?
Yeah, and they both got relatively new leaderships,
Yeah.
and we're still waiting to see how that's going to unfold.
Well, in Vietnam, we don't really know exactly who's running the show.
Well, I think Mr. Tholum is the general secretary of the party, but interestingly, he's brought back the prime minister before last, and it now seems to be boom times in Vietnam, and it'll be I predict 7 years of boom and probably a bust in about 8 years' time. But and the other thing, what's interesting, of course, is that both of them have moved in ways which are hostile to civil society, and yet we don't talk about that anymore. I mean, Indonesia far better than me, Bill. But yeah, I mean, what's going on in Indonesia is worrying in many ways in terms of civil society. But yeah, I mean, they are swing states. I mean, I would say ultimately Vietnam is it's a Leninist state. And that means that ultimately the Communist Party sees China, regardless of temporary disputes about South China Sea, etc., as a strategic friend, should we say? But at the same time, China is too big, too close, too domineering, and therefore Vietnam wants to be able to assert its independence, and has specific issues about the Mekong and the South China Sea, and plus anything to do with trade and all the rest of it. So yeah, be there, I suppose, is the answer. And I mean, I guess part of the problem is that we have UK interests in Southeast Asia are going to be anchored on trade, and trade is not something that necessarily governments can order people to do. You can't go and tell a company in the same way as you can tell a state-owned enterprise, go and trade with that country, and regardless of your profit margin or whatever. So, what are our exports going to be? Are they, as Andrew was suggesting, I think, sort of digital, outputs that we're going? Or are they going to be physical things? So yeah, I mean, I might actually defer to Andrew on exactly how what we're going to sell to Vietnam and Indonesia.
Yeah, and the only thing that came from some discussion I had earlier, I know work's been doing on Vietnam, the financial services sector. And actually, historically, the work I'd done there, and Prudential being the leading life insurer in Vietnam and a major player in the government bond market and so on. So there's stuff, whether it generates much revenue, I'm not sure, but in terms of influence and options for Vietnam and sort of win-win, maybe, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Finally, we have Leslie Fincher-Murray, who's going to wrap up all of this and
bow around it
and
feel good.
Well, but also explain sort of what's going on from the U.S.
It's
perspective.
my job as a speaker about the United States. Make it all feel good. No, I'll be relatively brief, but I did want to say a couple of things first. I have noticed in a lot of corridors where there are some really tremendous conversations going on, that those of you who sit inside have been mentioned. And I think that there's a virtue in taking your time and getting things right. Especially, I think that there's a virtue in not rushing to judgment or policy at a time of dramatic change and disruption. And I won't be surprised if these various documents that you've mentioned and that we're all watching for and very eager. I've set Monday thing. I won't be surprised if things change again. And I assume and I hope that these things are living documents, not, things that we have to literally interpret and highly dynamic. So the UK might want to adjust its strategy. So I'm not so sure I'm aligned with those who are admonishing the UK government for being late. I'm also usually late with writing deadlines, so I get it. And that's without having to build consensus amongst a number of people and agencies. I guess, you know, the elephant in the room is always the US and it's Donald Trump. And I would say a few things on that. I mean, you know, who knows about the US president, but there is, as we all know, a structural driver of this relationship that has to do with has grown and America has changed, that China's the pacing challenge for the United States, and that this isn't driven by whimsy or personality or anything else. And yes, different presidents have approached it differently at different points in time and had different kind of theories of the case, which is to say theories of how to make the case turn out in the way that you wish it to turn out. But the challenge has been a structural one. And so regardless of, you know, Trump's words and his oscillations, it's starting to feel to me, at least, and I hesitate to say it, are we under the rule?
No, we're being recorded.
No,
Oh, well, there you go. Well, I'll say it anyway. It's nice to know. It does feel today like there's kind of a movement back to the center, that the kind of the first 100 days of mass disruption, the first, if you remember back, the first several weeks, it wasn't even clear if Donald Trump was ever going to do very much about China, or in the very first several weeks, we weren't sure if he was ever going to get to Russia and Ukraine. It was about Greenland and Canada and a number of other things. So, you know, it's taken a while. And at the moment, a lot of things kind of are looking, you know, we've had the ruling on tariffs that came out of the trade court from Lower Manhattan today. Elon Musk is walking away from the game. People are more careful and invested and strategic, and they're kind of waking up and working on calling for more strategic policy, calling for, obviously on the domestic side, more pushback. So it is a highly dynamic space, but that doesn't change the overarching structural context. I have sat in on a number of panels where I've heard people say, on the record also, Bob Kagan being one of them, that he fully expects that given the level of disruption and the stance that the Trump administration is taking, that Europe, by the end of the Trump administration, Europe will, you know, not the European, Europe defined broadly, will form a strategic partnership with China. Others have, you know, gone a bit further in and sort of said that they fully expect that Europe will bandwagon with China in an effort to balance against US power. That's actually not a structural explanation. That has a lot more to do with how you interpret Trump as an individual and an aggressive person that has a lot of power behind him. But one way or the other, I do think that, you know, even though we kind of think America is the great uncertainty, there are things that are actually all that uncertain. And that is that these two states are going to be in conflict and in competition indefinitely. And that is going to create a series of choices, not necessarily, you know, going all the way in or going all the way out, but it will, for a very long period of time, the context for Europe will be about how to make choices, not whether to go all in with China or all in with the United States. Those are unsustainable propositions for all the reasons that we've just heard. It's unsustainable economically. It's probably unsustainable in security terms. It's definitely unsustainable and undesirable, in my view, from the point of view of Europe's capability and desirability, and especially the UK, in contributing to the goal of order building, such as you outlined it very concretely in the economic space, building norms on questions of technology, making sure that that space isn't ceded to China. Europe and the UK have a vital role to play in that space. So I don't think that there will be an either or choice, but there will be a series of phenomenally uncomfortable choices. And I guess the question mark on Trump is more how how uncomfortable are those choices? How much do they feel like they're on a knife edge? The leaders across Europe that are being in a position where one way or the other, there are choices to make. But to what extent is there a coercive threat, the coercive arm of the US economy, of security threats behind that? And I think in the first 100 days, it felt like it was going to be very coercive, that the economic linkage to security assistance or reassurance, not only on questions of Euro-Atlantic security generally, on questions of Ukraine specifically, but far beyond that, that there was going to be concrete linkage and economic coercion. And now I just don't know. Trump doesn't really like Putin. He doesn't really like the way things are turning out. He's, you know, they're off to Shangri-La today, Tulsi Gabbard, and today, right? And Hegseth. And they seem to be kind of going all in on pretty conventional US positions by all measures. So the question mark and the debates and the choices for Europe, I think the UK and Europe can be singularly focused on this without being, you know, it's very easy for me to say because I'm not turning up to government, but without being overly fixated on, you know, every day and every week of what Donald Trump says. I think there actually is more leverage and more capacity to think strategically than it sometimes has felt over the past 100 days. And I guess I just say my general view on this is it's a false choice and a poor choice it would be for the UK to say, you know, we're going to get out of the Indo-Pacific. What does that even mean? How would you get out of a global economy that's tremendously integrated, even if there are, you know, threats of decoupling more or less in different sectors or in different issues? How or why would you ever get out of a dynamic high growth area? On the security side, sure, it makes sense not to overinvest in terms of hard military power, but there's certainly something to be said for symbolic engagement, for demonstrating. And I guess here I do, you know, I do think that it makes sense with Trump, it made sense with Biden, it will make sense with whoever comes next, to signal that there is something at stake on the question of values and that there is a lean towards a liberal order building project, even if it has to be carefully managed in the Indo-Pacific. And to the extent that staying in the game in security terms, you know, isn't necessarily wise economically, I think it's symbolically important because they're not disaggregated sectors. Security is no longer disaggregated from the economy, not only because of Donald Trump, but because so much of this is about technology and economic security. So I think staying in the game symbolically, staying in the game certainly on economics, but staying in the game from the broader project, the broader point of view of contributing to order building. And this is a Trump-specific thing at a time when the Trump administration is not heavily invested in building rules and sustaining and adapting an international order in a way that I think the Biden administration actually was, whether folks liked it or not. He was certainly doing that.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, the first 100 days and the chaos thereof keeps sparking in my mind the idea of sort of 100 days reform and, you know, other doomed projects of the late Qing dynasty, and there's, you know, court intrigue that related there too. But if we think of this position of Europe vis-a-vis the US and China, I mean, I was shocked, and I should be careful because this was under the rule of the Chatham House rule. Recently, when I was in a different country in Western Europe, a relatively high-level official said that they thought that Europe as a whole, as well as particular countries within it, probably had more in common in terms of foreign policy and strategic goals with China than with the United States. Now, that was really a surprise to me. And then the comments you were just making sort of seemed to bolster the idea that this is perhaps a more widely held view than I had thought. But let's assume it's not the mainstream opinion and not going to grow, that in fact, you know, European thinking will move back the other way. Even if that's so, though, in this context where European strategic autonomy is now becoming a thing, right? Whether or not Trump is really going to walk away from NATO, clearly the US commitment is not strengthening to Europe. And Europe is being asked to be more strategically autonomous and self-supporting. From many perspectives, that can look like a win for China, right? Or at least an opportunity for China. And so one question I have by way of follow-up is it? And if so, is there anything the US could do to reduce that opportunity for China while still pushing Europe towards this more strategically autonomous position? And the second bit of follow-up I have is more on the sense of this chaotic reform. From the outside, at least, looking into the US from here, or what I can see, which is being an outsider within the US system, certainly, it looks like there's a tremendous amount of disunity and disarray over these basic questions of strategy and foreign policy direction. Is that in the United States? Yes. Inside the administration, inside the system. And in that context, it doesn't seem clear that there's a movement back to the center or in support of a liberal building, liberal institution building kind of project. And if there is that degree of disunity, is it possible, even if there's a sort of broad consensus that we should go in that direction, is it possible the US won't be able to deliver credibly and reliably within the next few years?
Those are great questions. I mean, first on the comment of those in Europe, in the West, who say that there's more in common between Europeans and China. I think they're making a bet on US, on civil society, on America's universities, courts, schools, churches, states, mayors, governors. And I think it's the wrong bet, but we don't know yet. Because there's Donald Trump, which I think probably it's fair based on what we've seen the president say and do at the headline level in the first 100 days, to say that in those first 100 days, Europeans had more in common with often what China was saying than with what Donald Trump is saying. But that is not America. America is a country of what, 380 million people, 50 states, 50 governors, multiple mayors, multiple universities, a highly decentralized state with a phenomenal amount of power that is held across many institutions, and in which I think it's still fair to say has the most developed, experienced, diverse, and robust civil society in the world. So I think it's premature to make a bet on whether Europe has more in common with China or with America. It might not be premature, and it's probably a moving target to make an assessment of the individual who was elected by 77 million Americans, who is the least popular president in modern history at the 100-day mark. So we don't know yet. And I would really call account to anybody who's willing to make that bet too soon. And I actually think we have a stake and we influence the outcome. And I say that as an analyst. I think we influence the outcome by our actions. So in terms of whether the US is kind of opening the gateway to China in its push to get Europe to do more, you know, stylistically, I mean, in some ways it follows on from my first point. Stylistically, absolutely. At the headline level of the language Donald Trump uses, absolutely he's opening the door. But in real terms, assistance to Ukraine, you know, was already kind of coming down, but hasn't been cut. There's now conversation about maybe having more sanctions against Russia, question mark. The US ambassador to NATO and everybody kind of below the level of Donald Trump, and even Donald Trump is signaling very clear that the United States is in NATO. There hasn't been implemented a radical change of policy, but there is consistency. Like, I don't like the language, and I think it's bad diplomacy, bad politics, and bad leadership. But there has been consistency across more than just the Trump administration on calling Europe to do a lot more. And in terms of the real things that are being asked for, they make Europe stronger, a better partner to the United States, better able to call account to the United States, and better able to deter not only Russia, but China in its partnership with Russia, which has very serious implications for, so you could argue if you take it below the headline level, that actually what the United States has been doing for some time, if Europe responds, I found the first 100 days of the Trump administration the most invigorating and exciting time I've ever been in Europe, because there's so much energy around really moving forward. It's a phenomenal time to be based in the UK and Europe because, you know, the language is having an impact. If Europe gets on board that agenda, it's good for Europe, it's good for the world, it's good for the United States, and it keeps, you know, everybody needs to be kept in check, and so it keeps China in check too. And your final question?
Disarray
Oh,
in the United
disarray,
States,
yeah.
and whether that will impede any attempt even at building liberal institutions.
Yeah,
if they
so
do
I wasn't sort of saying that we're going to get back to the old liberal international order. I don't think we are, and I don't think anybody's wanted that for several presidencies on both sides of the aisle. What I meant to say was that basic structural challenge between the United States and China isn't going away. It's there. It's, you know, I would also say that I don't think we're seeing disunity and disarray. I think we're seeing massive intentional disruption, contestation, division. It's like disarray and disunity is way too anodyne and agnostic. It is intentional, and there is a battle between everybody, a lot of people out of government, not just Democrats, a lot of Republicans who don't feel like they have a party, but are very committed to foreign policy. Look at the work of Kori Schake, who was, you know, here in London for 2 years, the American Enterprise Institute. She's leading their foreign security and defense policy division. People are not, there's not disunity. There's a battle. There's a lot of contestation. There are a lot of people, as we know, without jobs who want back in. There is a battle between USIP and the courts and the government. And so far, USIP has won. So it's not disunity. Disunity is just like, you know, that would be nice. Disarray would be nice. So does it get in the way of America having a strategy and executing on a strategy? It does, because I think it takes more than just, well, first of all, you know, the institutions of government, of the executive branch have been, some of them hollowed out. So how do you execute the policy, if to the extent that there's clarity on the policy, which I don't think there is? How do you execute if you don't have people to execute the policy? If you don't have, you know, you can have a very, and we should have a very serious argument about whether there should be a National Security Council and a State Department and. You can have that argument. We didn't always have it. It wasn't always this way. But when you just go in and gut things, how do you execute on your policy? So I don't think the current intentionally disruptive and divisive and provocative and aggressive approach either to America's partners and allies or to Americans employed in the foreign security and national defense part of the government is going to help the Trump administration achieve its objectives.
Great. Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions, and we do have at least one, maybe two microphones. We have two different microphones that can come around. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand, and you will be recognized and provided with a microphone.
Hi, I'm John Givens from, you want me to stand up? Or?
You can sit, stand,
Okay.
whatever you like.
I'm John Givens from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is a question for Dr. Vinjamuri. You said you thought things would settle down and tack to the center a little with this administration. I have to say, as an American who doesn't work on American politics, I'm a little surprised, and I was wondering if you meant that specifically in regards to the Indo-Pacific, or is that kind of a broader prediction or thought process, and if you could share just a little bit about it.
Let's perhaps take a bank of questions. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll take two or three and then.
Hi, Suzanne Rain, trustee at RUSI, and also connected with the Centre for Geopolitics. So it's lovely to see everyone together. And I have a question, Bill, which builds on a panel that you and I did a couple of weeks ago about transshipment and the inclusion of transshipment in the UK-US sort of trade deal. And it seems to me that this is America's new way of using economic tools to achieve geopolitical ends, because it's basically giving itself a lever to control how Chinese goods do or don't flow to America or back from America. And that impacts directly on the stuff that you were talking about Indonesia and Vietnam and all those countries which are the middle countries. So I'd be really interested to hear the panel's view on, is this the next way that America actually achieves its objectives through economics? And we're going to be right in the middle of that. Thank you.
Great. I think maybe one more.
Thanks very much. Scott Moore from the University of Pennsylvania. Question about global public goods and China. It strikes me that kind of on the list, and it is of course a long list, as you've all illustrated, of kind of ramifications of the change in administration, is that we really don't have any role for the U.S. government in global public good provision in the way that we did a couple of months ago, and especially related to China. So I'm just kind of curious the panel's view on the extent to which cooperation on climate, health, the whole litany of sort of global public goods issues might play a stronger role in the UK, Europe, China, and/or Indo-Pacific relationship.
Great. Thank you for that first round of three really excellent questions. I think probably let Leslie go first, and then maybe Andrew, and then Philip or Bill, if you want to also chip in as well. But
I'm going
Leslie,
to say one thing on the public goods question, and then the colleague from Atlanta. This is one of the things that puzzles me most. We just did a research project on competing visions of international order, and 12 countries that we looked at with people who are, leading scholars over many decades writing, and we just couldn't see, to the extent that these other states had visions for international order and their place with it, we couldn't see anybody apart from China that even aspired to provide public goods on the global level. There's certain pockets, middle powers that want to, be negotiators of peace agreements, or have tried, or that, India has its aspirations on being a leader of the global South and investing in digital public infrastructure and all the rest of it. And the US is kind of out of the game right now. So it felt like the thing where, if we think about international order as that being an absolutely critical component, whether it's predictable, reliable rules for the international trade order, whether it's rules that are, broken all the time, but nonetheless they're rules about peace and security and sovereignty and intervention, or whether they're really the, health, climate, environment, et cetera, humanitarian interventions, none of it seems to be kind of where the beating pulse of any of the great powers are right now. I don't think that things are going back to, the gentleman from Atlanta, I don't think there's a reversion back to normal politics in the United States, actually quite the reverse. I think that as we're seeing Trump kind of not get the initial things that he wanted to get, Putin to behave and play ball and reset, the relationship with Russia, Netanyahu to allow him to make the Middle East his, peace deal of the century. The list is long. Maybe there will be some progress on Iran. But as he's not kind of winning geopolitically beyond America's borders, I think that, some of the realities of geopolitics, China's not a friend. Russia's not a friend. There seems to be a little bit of tacking to the center on that. At home, quite the reverse. It's a battle, quite the reverse. I mean, deciding that you're going to monitor the social media of international students who would like to go to a number of great US universities, kicking international, I mean, these things haven't happened yet, but the effort, and on and on and on, that is not normal politics. And God forbid that, we gotta hope it never is normal politics.
Yeah, so I'd start I'll focus mainly on the transshipment question. I think short answer is yes. I mean, what the Trump administration is seeking to do is put clauses in related to China in any of its trade agreements. The UK deal was really the first one, and so even though it's actually less applicable in many ways in the UK, it's a stake in the ground. It's two dimensions. One is it's clearly more applicable in places like Vietnam and Indonesia, or in Canada and Mexico, and the concerns there. Secondly, then we get to this wonderfully elastic word transshipment. What is transshipment, and where can there be a commonality of interest in pursuing that? And I know a number of Southeast Asian governments working on that at the moment. So there are the specific question, transshipment. You send the stuff from China, turns up in Vietnam, maybe you change the label on it, or you just lift it on another ship and out it goes. And there's been zero value added, and that's clearly sort of, in a sense, playing around with tariffs. And these Southeast Asian governments also then say, yes, we don't want, or maybe we liked it while it happened, but now you've got the spotlight on it, we don't want to be taking part in that. And there's been some work done about how much is this real just transshipment, this just playing around. Maybe 15% of the exports out of Vietnam was one academic number a few years ago. But then there's, well, is it transshipment if I actually do something to it, do processing? And I think that's where the game is going to be, is where it's the Chinese solar company moves to Malaysia or Cambodia, it actually does a whole lot of stuff there, but the US decides, well, because you've got a Chinese owner, even though you did all this stuff there, we're going to treat you badly, which is what happened with the solar panels. And you see it with the discussions on electric vehicles in Mexico and elsewhere, saying anything which has Chinese software in it and a connected vehicle will not be allowed into the country. And I think that's back to the same question as you say, how hard does Trump then go on that? Because if everyone can agree, and I say one government I know in Southeast Asia is working now on, how can we demonstrate to the Americans that we are controlling transshipment? And actually, we put in touch someone who's been working on Brexit and the Northern Ireland sort of issues around Brexit, saying, can we take that to demonstrate goods flow? Because we're acting in good faith. And that's fine. There's a common interest there. And you can even get China maybe signed up to that, saying that's all good. But as soon as you start saying, no, any Chinese company or any American company that's making something in China sends half of it to Southeast Asia, is that also Chinese content? Then you get into a real problem. So I think that is a hot new area. And on global public, because I would just say sort of briefly, I think China does have these great overarching visions, great as in big and vast, and great as in some people like them, but they're lacking in very many specifics. China's lacking in, everyone's lacking in sort of resources and effort and priorities. You need to figure out what are you actually going to do. And what China tends to do is then focus on things that have immediate benefit for itself, and equally does not want to go around completely overturning the existing rules-based order. But it has something there, and often we found, again, in the work we did at Chatham House the other year, that there isn't a Western vision going out to the rest of the world saying this is what the world can look like and how we're going to deal with things. And with the US pulling back even more, others need to step in.
Bill?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not a good look for certain Southeast Asian countries when their trade deficit with China increases at exactly the same rate as their trade surplus with the US. So that applies to, Malaysia and Vietnam and probably a few other countries. But I mean, it's partly because China, as you were suggesting, has tried. The Vietnamese are just as upset about their trade deficit with China, and so they've been pressing, the Chinese investors to come and invest in Vietnam. So they do. So then now, we end up with in effect the Chinese trade surplus being routed by Vietnam. The other thing I would say, I mean, it's an adjunct to the transshipment question, but have you read the America First investment policy published on the 21st of February? Section 2B says, for investment in the United States, businesses involved in critical technology, critical infrastructure, personal data, and other sensitive areas, that's all pretty broad, restrictions on foreign investors' access to the United States assets will ease in proportion to their verifiable distance and independence from the predatory investment and technology acquisition practices of the PRC and other foreign adversaries or threat actors. So if you want to invest in the US, you've got to prove that you're not investing in China or connected to China or whatever. I mean, that's going to affect an awful lot of people and businesses. Okay, that's really, really important if that gets put into legislation.
If that gets put into legislation.
Wow.
But yeah.
Well, just to really cheer us up, I was thinking
Yeah.
that kind of connects the shipments bit of transshipments with the global public goods, which is, there is a kind of crisis of order at sea, quietly. I mean, you can see on one end of the spectrum, you've got a regime which, you know, was intended to apply to Russian exports of oil, and has now got to the stage where Russian Navy is convoying civilian ships carrying oil because it's part of a sort of black fleet which was being disrupted, particularly in the Baltic. Obviously, you've got the Red Sea and stuff being attacked and deals being done, not really clearly with what outcome. I think our carrier strike group is currently going through the Red Sea, so hopefully that's all right. You've got the quarantine so-called scenario around Taiwan becoming the most sort of favored scenario now for looking at forms of pressure PRC puts on Taiwan. And you've got similar kinds of sabotage of undersea infrastructure cables going on around that geography as well as in the Baltic. And the question arises, you know, how do you apply international law at sea beyond the jurisdiction of territorial seas and exclusive economic zones when you've got, you know, cable properties that still belongs to somebody, needs to be protected, needs to be done under some form of rule of law. So you've got international law trying to be extended out to some of the economic activities at sea, which are made possible by new technology like deep sea mining. And so there's actually a really big demand now for order building, if that's what we're thinking of doing and making up for a gap. So probably not a good time to be withdrawing OPVs if that's what we're doing, or, you know, not spending enough on the Navy in general.
Yes, very upbeat. Are there any other questions? We have time maybe for one or two more. Oh, wow, lots of questions all of a sudden. Big one here.
Hello, it's Sam Olsen, Chief Analyst at Sibylline. For those of us who spent a lot of time in the Indo-Pacific and have dedicated much of their professional careers to persuading people of the importance, one of the things that saddens me is when spending time with the political establishment here is basically the irrelevance that they attach to the region. And Bill's comments there about the SDR, which we thought were coming, about pulling back, you know, have been highlighted. So my question to you is, with an inward-looking government, as most British governments are very inward-looking, how do we actually persuade the political establishment that an investment by the UK into creating stronger links with the Indo-Pacific is actually of benefit to the country and specifically their inward-looking agendas?
Okay, great. We'll take the two more that I saw. So, yeah. And then also to the other side. Oh, you had the same question. Okay. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Sam Godsland. I'm from Wilton Park. Thank you to all the panel for really fascinating presentations. It struck me that the title of the session was the UK and Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and we had three questions right off the bat about the USA and China. And so I'm just going to reflect on that and ask if perhaps the panel could unpack slightly further the European appetite for what you, Bill, referred to as the time of strategic autonomy for Europe is now. You know, is there the will for this? Is there the unity for this? To what extent is Europe ready to step up and take this mantle on, or are we going to just watch what China and America are doing and hope for the best? Thank you.
Okay. We do have time for one more. I think there was one.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, in the back, sorry.
Maybe just, sorry, Paul Staples from Smith Square Partners, very quickly advising companies how to try and navigate the various hurricanes that Bill partly alluded to. Just one or two quick observations just to amplify perhaps the last question. I just reminded myself of just how small some of the figures are in terms of our exports to places like Vietnam, less so Thailand. But just maybe a view from the City of London to overlay tonight's proceedings gently. I do think really it's all about inward investment for the UK. Bill touched on it. We've got to be realistic about debt levels. We've got to be realistic about very limited optionality when you're running an economy at sub 1% GDP growth. And we know, I'll just make a very quick observation question at the end of this, won't be long. The journey anyway, up and through 2.5% of GDP in defense spending, depending on how you think the spending review is going to come out. But my network is telling me that that spending review is going to have some very, very significant ramifications for allocation of government spending. I would also just add, my network in New York tells me, you know, US bond yields at 5% are telling you something very, very significant indeed about US government borrowing. It's not been mentioned tonight once, but that's fine. But I happen to think that's one of the most significant factors at work in the next 12 to 18 months. We'll see how that plays out. Just very, very quickly, I went to a board meeting today, and this is sort of for all of you, but particularly Bill, maybe, because it will resonate with him. Brilliant company in Oxford, brilliant Formula One heritage, brilliant prototype design, almost certainly one of the best companies in the world at developing 400 pounds a go unmanned drones. Huge potential interest from India, from Thailand, from Japan. And I had a meeting at 4 o'clock this afternoon with officials from the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence saying, good news, we can host a competition to decide which prototype wins. Bad news, there is no procurement policy in place, no supply chain policy in place, and we can't tell you to within the nearest 2 or 3 years when we might be in a position to give you a production contract. So the mismatch between the opportunity on the one hand and what's actually there on the ground in terms of funding, supply chain investment is acute. But just maybe to give people some good news, the order book outside the UK for this company is totally, you know, as much as it can be, is really tangible. So just to sort of maybe give people a bit of reassurance, if the UK government can just come to the table with a little bit more punch on things like supply chains and order books and procurement and export licensing, there are some really great companies, a lot of them based outside London, who are genuinely ready to go to make this defense renaissance come a little bit to fruition.
Great. Thank you very much, all three, for excellent questions. Let me just ask the panelists in the same order that we spoke first to go through and answer any or all of those three relatively quickly, if possible, because we are almost out of time. So Philip, we'll start with you.
Well, I think on the question about, you know, how do we convince people making decisions in politics about the importance of some of this, probably have to go back to the educational stage, because, you know, I think the politicians hopefully are responding to, you know, what they're hearing, not, you know, from business, but also from the voter. And I do find it a shame, you know, in our level of incoherence that we've been saying through these previous national security, you know, integrated review and so on, that this is an important area in the economy and so on. At the same time, the place I got my education in East Asia at Sheffield University, as a School of East Asian Studies for a very long time, is sort of being broken up and dissolving. You know, so we are completely working at cross purposes. You know, we regularly identify Japan as our primary security partner in the region. I got my Japanese studies education at Sheffield. I don't know if somebody, you know, going in now would be able to access that. So we have to fix that. What is the European appetite for sort of an autonomous approach to the region? I don't think it's looking very good either, I'm afraid. And again, it's to do with the money. I mean, if we're not prepared to spend resources on the things we decide we need to be effective, then it's not going to happen. So at the moment, if we are not going to, you know, raise, I mean, in the area I'm talking on, defense and security, to a level where we can not just support Ukraine, modernize our own armed forces, invest in future capabilities like GCAP and AUKUS, but also contribute to stability in Asia, then, you know, we're not going to be having any sort of very measurable impact.
Andrew?
Yeah, I'm not sure what cheering thing I'm going to add to all this. I mean, fundamentally, there is a challenge on resourcing so that, you know, yes, it ends up being inward looking, what we do in the UK in some ways, but there are a lot of legitimate domestic needs. I think part of it is more education, more travel amongst key decision makers, particularly on the governmental side, be they politicians or in the civil service, to really sort of see and feel. Now, we have to talk here about Asia, I'll talk particularly about Korea. It could be China, but people always then have a reason, oh, but China, it becomes sensitive. We should do that. But equally, just go to Korea, go to Vietnam, see what's been happening in how those places have changed in the past 10 years, the past 20 years, and sort of somehow get some of that energy and practicality and learn from some of those governments. That was a bit of being the part of the thing. Early on in COVID, there were reports about how to deal with COVID, and some came out of China, and people then dismissed those as lies, but then they came out of Korea and Taiwan as well. And then I remember reading on Twitter like 9 months later that some European research lab had identified XYZ thing about COVID. I said, yes, but Korea identified that 9 months ago, but the scientists and the scientific base in the West didn't want to take that in because that's too alien. So there's something about opening up to that. And I think there is something on foreign direct investment that Europe, there's more will than there has been for a long, long time. I'm still pretty skeptical about it. I think that is sort of where the rubber hits the road of finding ways of working with China while addressing some security questions, particularly around data on the inbound investment. And it is also down to how does China fit into that? How much do they want to actually move and adjust on some of the real issues that there are coming out of China as well? So EU-China relations may go more positively, but they're reasonably staid and difficult still at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I should declare an interest. My wife is a Labour MP. So not that she takes much interest in the Asia Pacific, much to my chagrin. Well, yeah, indeed. Maybe she's typical. Yeah, but I would say that ministers have been getting a lot of air miles. I mean, Catherine West has been to Asia Pacific a lot. David Lammy went to the ASEAN meeting. They are getting around. Maria Eagle, Minister for Defence Procurement, is in New Zealand today. That's why she wasn't at your Oxfordshire shareholders meeting. So go and have a word with Maria Eagle. You're not planning to outsource production to China, I take it. Yeah, so I would contest that the government is that inward-looking. I mean, it has domestic priorities, it has reform snapping at their heels. And thinking of that, I mean, it would be helpful, I think, if people who want to, argue for greater defence spending don't ignore the domestic constraints on the government completely. There are some people, even from this building, who seem to think that somehow the benefits, issue can just be written off. That they're all a bunch of malingerers, and you don't have to spend money on benefits. You've got to buy more weapons. I mean, that isn't obviously how the government has to approach things. So, kind of some recognition that you actually have to make this case, rather than sometimes people at the security end of the spectrum end up as Conservative Party spokespeople. But look, I mean, just look at how the AfD have weaponized the "don't spend money on Ukraine, spend it on good Germans" narrative, and how that has been presumably amplified by Russian bots and all the rest of it, and think how that could also work here, quite easily, I think. And which then kind of brings us into sort of UK and Europe. We're both ASEAN dialogue partners, but I don't see any appetite for the EU and the UK to sort of coordinate their positions before they go to ASEAN meetings. I don't see many efforts to kind of deconflict in terms of what we're offering to countries in the Indo-Pacific. The UK goes and trains Vietnamese peacekeepers for UN missions. The EU turns up and says, no, we want to train you for EU missions. And kind of how do you deconflict that? It would be nice. But there clearly is an effort by this certainly many MPs in this government, I think, to rebuild our relationship with the EU. I hope that it's not done at the expense of relations with the Indo-Pacific. And finally, yeah, bond markets. I'm with James Carville. If you don't know that quote, I want to come back. I want to be reincarnated as a bond market. Then you can intimidate everybody. Yeah.
Hey, thank you very much. Leslie, you get the last word.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. I guess there was a question about US debt. I mean, it's catastrophic and we're living on the brink of disaster. And I can't see my way through that at all. Probably one of the most significant destructive moments is that, that bill, that great big beautiful bill, and and even Musk has pulled the plug on that. So we'll see. No, but that's kind of one of those things that it's so big that you sort of go to sleep and you have to park it and keep moving because it's just too big to kind of see our way through it. I'm much more optimistic about Europe actually than the US debt. And I actually do think that there is genuine ambition. And I think that there's evidence of that ambition. And I don't cut the UK off from that. I've lived here a long time now. And I work at Chatham House, so I'm sitting around the table listening and asking questions and trying to understand and feeling frustrated and all the rest of it. But I do think there's genuine ambition right now because of Ukraine, because of Trump, for a number of reasons. And I suspect it will result. This is a long-term project, not a short-term project. But I suspect that the direction of travel is absolutely in the right direction.
Great. Thank you very much all for coming, and look forward to chatting further at the reception. Thanks.